Well, it's good for all of us to be together tonight, and I'm going to encourage you, if you would, to open up your Bibles very quickly, and let's get into a study tonight of Paul's arrest and his being in prison, and then ultimately getting to the city of Rome. This morning we concluded the third missionary journey as Paul had come to Jerusalem, or at least he was about to get to Jerusalem. But arrival there brought some great opposition that led to Paul being imprisoned for the next several years. And I want to say that again, I want you to get it. Paul was in prison for the next several years. Can you imagine? We're going to start this evening by his arrival, if you'll turn to Acts chapter 21 and verse 17. And this kind of introduces us into what we'll be looking at through the rest of the book of Acts tonight. When Paul came to the city of Jerusalem, by the way, how did he get there? If you look at the end of the journey on this next map, and we're going to see down here close on the right-hand side near the bottom, the city of Tyre. They come and they land at the city of Tyre. And then Paul goes from there up to the city of Jerusalem. And when they get there, the brethren are excited. They're eager to have Paul and his traveling companions to come with them. The following day, they meet James and the elders of the Jerusalem church, and Paul told them in detail about what God had done among the Gentiles in that journey that, as I mentioned this morning, is some 4 to 5 years in length. And they rejoiced and glorified God in all the good things that happened in that third missionary journey. But I wish it could just say rejoice and that's the end of it, but James and the elders explained to Paul there was a serious problem. And the serious problem is that a lot of the people in the city of Jerusalem, Jewish Christians, were upset. They were fired up. And they were fired up because they had heard about Paul. They heard that he was, in essence, in their mind, giving up on the law of Moses. They heard about him teaching Gentiles and bringing them to Christ. They heard that he was telling Gentiles, you don't have to obey the law of Moses. You don't have to be circumcised. And they were livid when they heard that he even was telling Jews, you don't have to follow the law of Moses anymore. Well, by the way, you and I know he was just telling them the truth. He was telling Jews, you don't even have to be circumcised. And again, that just infuriated them. James and the elders in chapter 21, down about verses 20 and following, advised Paul to take 4 men who had made a vow to purify them and himself and to pay for their expenses, and then they could shave their heads, a sign that their vow was finished. And so the next day, Paul took these 4 men to the temple and began that purification process, which lasted ultimately a week. And just about the time that week is over, Jews from Asia, that's back over there, we talked about where they'd been on that third missionary journey, second and third journey, by the way. They came into the city of Jerusalem, and they stirred up the whole city of Jerusalem against Paul. They charged him with opposing everything about Judaism. They accused him of desecrating the temple by bringing Greeks into it, by the way. When Paul got to Jerusalem, he brought a man named Trophimus with him. This was one of his fellow missionaries. He was an Ephesian. He was a man who was a Jewish man, but they accused him, Paul, of bringing Greeks, Gentiles, into the temple area. And so there was absolute fury that just raged in the city of Jerusalem, so much so that they literally dragged Paul out of the temple, shut its doors, and they were about to kill him. By the way, remind you this morning, as Paul landed over on the coast there at the end of the third journey, these daughters of Philip had said, you're going to be in trouble if you go to the city of Jerusalem. Agabus had prophesied that. The Lord had told him he was going to be in trouble if he went there. There was going to be all kinds of mistreatment when he got there. And so when he gets to the city and they drag him out of the temple, they're about to kill him, the chief captain of the Roman garrison, his name was Claudius Lysias, hearing this uproar, took some soldiers and delivered Paul and took him into the fort that's called Antonia there in the city of Jerusalem. As they get to the top of the steps to this fort, Paul asks this commander a question. He says, "Would you allow me to speak to this mob?" And so the captain, not knowing, he thought that maybe Paul was a rebel. Not realizing that he was a Jew, he allowed Paul to speak, and Paul did so in the Hebrew language. And by the way, now turn in your Bible to chapter 22, because there's the speech that Paul gave to this crazy mob of people who were so livid against him. And he defended himself to these people as he told about his education at the feet of Gamaliel. He described his efforts as a persecutor of the church, verses 4 and 5. He told about his conversion, and by the way, when we look back in chapter 9 about his conversion, I brought some of these details out. I won't look at them tonight. But Paul explained his conversion, and he told about what happened in Damascus, and he told about God's mission for him, that the Lord said, "Paul, I have a mission for you, and that's to take the gospel." Are y'all ready for this? Jesus had a mission for me to take the gospel to the Gentiles, and they went ballistic. In fact, chapter 22, verses 22 to 30, they listened quietly until he mentioned that fact. And as soon as he did, they became enraged and wanted to kill him. The violence erupted so bad that the commander ordered that he be taken into the fort, the castle there, and he was going to scourge him. Again, you have to remember, this guy thought that Paul was a Gentile, and he planned to beat him and find out what crime he was really guilty of. Here's the idea: you beat a person until they ultimately end up telling what the reality, the truth is, and that's what he planned to do. But just about the time he starts to do that, Paul asks a question, and the question is it lawful for you to scourge a man who's a Roman and uncondemned? And Claudius Lysias has a problem, because you can't beat a Roman citizen, and so he stopped the scourging. However, he sets up a plan, and the next day, Paul is going to stand before the Sanhedrin. That's, again, as we've talked about in the past, this is kind of like the Supreme Court of the nation of Israel. And in chapter 23, you have that defense that Paul speaks as he stands there before the Sanhedrin, and he talks with them about his life and what he's done. This was the day after his arrest and his speech to the Jews. The commander takes off his bonds. He takes him to the Sanhedrin to meet those Jews there, and Paul stands before them and gives a defense. And if you all remember, turn to chapter 23 and verse 1. Paul begins this by saying, "Men and brethren, I've lived in all good conscience before God unto this day." I just want to stop and ask you to think about something. Do you understand the implication to that statement? Paul is saying, when I was persecuting Christians, I was doing it from a sincere conscience. When I was on the road to Damascus, I thought it was the right thing to do. When I submitted to Christ, I did it because I'd learned more information about Jesus, and I was convinced that he was the Son of God. When I've taught ever since then, I've lived in all good conscience before God. As soon as Paul says that in verse 2, the high priest Ananias ordered somebody standing beside Paul to strike him in the mouth. And Paul retorted and said, "God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. You sit in judgment of me according to the law, and you do command me to be struck according to the law." By the way, what he's saying is, what the high priest ordered here was against the law of Moses. However, Paul was very stern in his statement to this man. He didn't realize that this man was the high priest, and there's a discussion that goes on there about that, and Paul kind of apologizes, saying, "I didn't know that you were the high priest." But in verses 6 to 10, there is an amazing thing that occurs right in the Sanhedrin, because Paul drove a wedge between the members of the Sanhedrin. Some of them were Pharisees, some of them were Sadducees. What's the difference? A Sadducee denied the supernatural and the resurrection from the dead. They only followed the first 5 books of the law, what's called the Torah. They didn't believe in angels and spirits. whereas Pharisees believed in the supernatural and in the resurrection. And so Paul stands up and says, hey folks, I'm somebody who believes in resurrection. And he does this to drive a wedge between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And they turn against each other right in the midst of their court setting. Discord arose, and some of the Pharisees stand up and say, we don't find a thing in the world wrong with this guy. Whereas the Sadducees, they found all kinds of things wrong with him. And so the commander, as all of this is going on and it's getting really intense, the commander, concerned for Paul's life, because they're ready to tear him apart, took him by force and brought him back to the fort. By the way, here's the third time in 2 days that this commander has, in essence, saved Paul's life. Because in the city, when he's standing out there on the steps, and now this event, how these people are so angry and wanting to kill him. Then there's an interesting story, starting at verse 11 and through 24, of something that happened that night. The Lord spoke to Paul and said to him, Paul, I don't want you to be afraid. Now y'all got to think about this. This is a prophecy that has an extended period of time. Paul, I don't want you to be afraid. You're going to teach the gospel. You're going to go to and speak the gospel in Rome. That's an amazing prophecy, especially right in the circumstances here. Remember that he's in this fort at this time. The next day, there were about 40 Jews who conspired and made a vow, we're not going to eat a bite, we're not going to drink a drop until we kill Paul. And they planned to get it done like this. Their plot was to have the high priest to ask this commander, Claudius Lysias, for another trial. These 40 men were going to ambush Paul on the way to the trial, and they were going to kill him. And they told the council to inform this commander that he should bring Paul to the Sanhedrin the next day for him to be tried. There's a young man, he's Paul's nephew, his sister's son, who heard the plot. And he came to the fort and he told Paul about the plot. Paul told him to tell the centurion about these 40 men, the oath that they had made, and that they were going to be lying in wait to kill Paul. And that commander sent this young man away telling him, don't you say anything to anybody about this. But the commander immediately, here it is in the evening, that commander immediately amassed 470 soldiers and got them ready to depart Jerusalem. And they left Jerusalem that night at 9 o'clock in the midst of the darkness. This man understands that Paul's life is deeply in danger. And so he decides to move him before the Jews could even request that new trial. Paul then is taken from Jerusalem to Caesarea, verses 25 to 36 in this text. The commander wrote a letter for the soldiers to take. A ruler named Felix. You all have heard about Felix. He's going to be sent down to Caesarea, and he's going to be taken to Felix to be heard. A large band of soldiers took Paul, brought him in the night to Antipatris, verse 31, and then 70 horsemen the next day took him on to Caesarea. And they delivered him to Felix. They gave this letter that Claudius Lysias had written, and that's going to be Paul's home, in essence, for the next 2 years. I want you all to think about this. The Lord had told him when he's in that fort in the city, you're going to go to Rome. Well, he goes down to Caesarea, and folks, he's going to be there for 2 years. In essence, being held unlawfully, but being held there, and trials, etc. And we're going to just briefly talk about some of those. So here comes some of the trials in chapter 24 through 26, as he's there for over 2 years in Caesarea. First of all is a trial before Felix, chapter 24, verses 1 to 26. There's a great orator who comes down, kind of like a lawyer, who comes down from Jerusalem, and 5 days after Paul is brought to Caesarea, Ananias the high priest comes down with Tertullus, who's an orator and kind of like, again, an attorney, and brings him down and begins to make statements First of all, praising Felix, but secondly, he turns against Paul and he says about Paul, Felix, this guy is a pest. This guy is a plague. He has literally infected the whole world. Everywhere he goes, he's infecting the world with this crazy message that he's preaching. That's verses 5 and 6. He accused Paul of being an instigator of a new religion or a sect of the Nazarenes, which, by the way, is a castigation of Jesus being from Nazareth. He accuses Claudius Lysias of forcibly and violently rescuing Paul from the angry Jews. And he says that Lysias had ordered the accusers to come to Caesarea and state their case against Paul before Felix, and so we're here to do this. All the Jews with Tertullus affirmed that all these charges that he's made are absolutely true. This man is a vicious man. He's trying to destroy religion in the world. And then in verses 10 to 21, Paul defends himself to Felix. He begins by complimenting this man. He talks about 12 days earlier. Keep in mind, he came to Jerusalem. This is 12 days after he got to Jerusalem that he's being tried down at Caesarea. Paul says, when he mentions this 12 days, he's saying, how in the world could I be the kind of pest and troublemaker that these guys are accusing me of? I've only been in town 12 days. It's kind of hard to do, isn't it? He says that no one had seen him disputing or causing trouble in the temple, the synagogue, or anywhere else in Jerusalem. He says that these accusations, the charges against him, simply could not be proven. He acknowledges that he's a Christian. He's a part of a religion that the Jews call a sect, and affirmed that this religion is the one that the law of Moses and the prophets foretold. This is simply what back in the Old Testament has been prophesied. Now the Messiah is here. Here is the gospel that the Messiah was bringing to the world. And he declares that Christianity is a religion of hope, a religion of the resurrection of the dead. And he explained why he was in Judea. That it had been years since he'd been there, but now he's come not to stir up trouble, but rather to bring financial aid to assist Jewish brethren who are struggling because of famine and a lack of funds, and he's there to help them. As you go further in this, you see Felix's response, verses 22 to 27, to the Jews' complaint and to Paul's defense. Felix understood a lot about Jewish religion. He understood some about Christianity. And so he kind of had a baseline of understanding of what the issues were. He understood, here's what's going on. This is a struggle between people who follow the law of Moses and those who follow Jesus Christ. And so he said, I'll make a decision after I confer with Lysias. That would kind of take some of the heat away for a moment. And he commanded one of his centurions to be given charge of Paul, and he's kind of put under house arrest, so to speak, verse 23. This is when Felix, y'all remember his wife's name? Drusilla. This is when Felix and Drusilla came to Paul and to hear his message. And Drusilla, by the way, she had been married before, and I'm not going to give you all the details about it, but she had been married before. And Felix used a sorcerer to get her to leave her husband and to marry him. Felix was a conniver. He was an adulterer. The Bible says in verse 25, and I'd like for you to turn there with me to chapter 24, verse 25, and read this statement of what Paul does with Felix and Drusilla. After some days, when Felix came with his wife Drusilla, who was Jewish, he sent for Paul and heard him concerning the faith in Christ. My wife and I want to hear more about this Christianity stuff. Now, as he reasoned about righteousness, self-control, and, let me turn the page here, and judgment to come, Felix was afraid and answered, "Go away for now. When I have a convenient time, I'll call for you." Question: why did Felix have an intrigue about the gospel and all of a sudden, I don't want to hear any more about it? Well, here's why. Because his wife, being a Jew, understood some things about the law of Moses. He understood some things about Christianity. We want to hear more about this. But Paul's message was about righteousness. Answer this question. What is Paul saying to Felix and Drusilla when he talks about righteousness? You're supposed to do what's right in treating fellow men. You have taken a man's wife away from him by using a sorcerer. He's saying to him, you have stolen a man's wife by practicing deceit and dishonesty. Secondly, he reasoned with him of temperance, about self-control. He is saying that man needs to practice self-control when tempted, and in essence is accusing Felix of allowing lust to lead him to steal a man's wife and to cause him to live in adultery. Number three, he reasons with him about judgment to come. You understand what's happening. Felix, you're a sinner. You need salvation. You need Jesus Christ because of the sinful life that you're living. And Felix's response, he was terrified, and in essence said to Paul, go now, and when I have a time later, I will send for you. By the way, many of you, most of you here tonight, I hope have read the rest of the New Testament. I have a question for you. Did Felix ever find the convenient time? Nope. No record of it at all. But watch this. It's heartbreaking. Remember, this is 12 days after Paul's arrested in Jerusalem. Felix held Paul even though he knew he was innocent. And he kept him there for 2 years under house arrest, and did it for this reason, verses 26 and 27. He held Paul in hopes of extorting money either from Paul or other Christians that would buy his release. And Paul wasn't going to do that. The Christians weren't going to do that. And so for 2 years, he is held until Felix is replaced as the ruler. That leads us to the next event, chapter 24 through chapter 26, where Paul is now tried, held by, and tried under the reign of a man named Festus. Festus succeeded Felix as a governor over Judea. He was a governor from 60 to 62. And 3 days after he is appointed, he goes up to Jerusalem to confer with the Jewish leaders. And the first thing they say to this guy is, we need to talk to you about a man that's down there that's been held by Felix, and we need you to do something about him. Who is it? It's Paul. They requested a trial to be held in Jerusalem. I wonder why they did that. Well, if you think about the plot earlier, you know why. They wanted to try to kill him. Festus told them to come down to Caesarea when he returned there, and he returned 10 days later, and ultimately there's going to be a trial. They come down, they come to the judgment seat, and they present many serious charges. Verse 7 of chapter 25, many serious charges against him. But Paul denies the charges, and he said, I have not broken the law of Moses. I have not profaned the temple. I have not violated Roman law. I have not done anything. I'm not guilty. There's no reason for me to be held like I'm being held. Y'all watch this. When Paul says, I'm an innocent man, Festus says, well, if you're innocent, then why don't you just allow me to take you up to Jerusalem and let's have a trial in Jerusalem and prove that? You understand what's going on? Another attempt to try to placate the Jews, maybe give them a chance to attack him. And so it's at this time, and I know most of you have heard about this plea, it's at this time that Paul makes that statement and says, I appeal to Caesar. I'm not going to go through this anymore. I have been illegitimately accused and held, and so I appeal to Caesar. Now, for us today, we don't relate to that. But for a Roman citizen, the idea of appealing to Caesar was a legally binding request that had to be observed. They had to give him his request as a Roman citizen. And so, folks, by the very appeal that Paul makes here, he's going to go to Rome. Now, not going to get there tonight when he makes this appeal, but he's going to go to Rome, and it's going to happen. That leads to chapter 25, verses 13 to 17, because Festus has a problem. Festus, the governor over Judea, okay, I'm going to send this guy to Rome, and he's going to be sent there to be tried. What am I going to charge him with? Because he didn't have anything to charge him with. And so Festus has a couple of people that come down to visit him. You all have heard about him, King Agrippa and Bernice, his wife. They come to meet Festus at Caesarea. By the way, Agrippa is the grandson of King Herod and the son of Agrippa I. Bernice was listen to this, she's the sister of Drusilla and Agrippa II. She was the incestuous wife of Agrippa. She was married to her brother. And so they come down to visit family, and when Agrippa and Bernice come down, they're there with Festus, and he says, I need to talk to you. I got a problem, and I don't know how to deal with it. After a few days, Festus told Agrippa about Paul's case that he'd inherited from Felix. And Agrippa says, you know what, I'd like to hear this guy. I'd like to talk with him. I'd like to hear what he says, and was granted the privilege to do so. Verse 22. Verse 23, the next day, Agrippa and Bernice come into the judgment hall with much royal flair and pomp, and Festus explains the circumstances of what has happened, why he's got this guy under his care, and he's wanting an answer. And in chapter 26, you have Paul making his case before King Agrippa. Paul explained his loyalty to the law of Moses, his opposition to Christianity, what happened in his conversion, again, I'm not going to go through that tonight, and his commission that Jesus gave him to take the gospel to Gentiles. In verse 21, he explained that the Jews wanted to kill him because his commission was from Jesus, that he was to be a light to Jews and to Gentiles. And it's interesting that Festus was infuriated at Paul and accused him of being a raving lunatic. And Paul said, I'm just telling the truth. He knew that Agrippa understood the circumstances, verse 26. And when Paul asked Agrippa if he believed the Old Testament prophets, and he immediately said, I know you do, Agrippa's response, do you all remember Agrippa's response? Almost. You persuade me to be a Christian. Again, we know the rest of the Bible. As far as we know, nothing ever happened in his life. Festus and Agrippa and Bernice all agree that Paul has done nothing worthy of or deserving of death, that he should have been released. Are y'all ready for this? If he hadn't made an appeal to Caesar. Paul, you said too much. When you made an appeal to Caesar, sorry, you have to go to Rome. Well, the Lord's told him he's going to go there anyway, right? Now, the rest of this book is the trip to Rome, and we're going to just briefly go through some of this, but I want you to look at chapters 27 and 28 on what happens as Paul ends up in Rome. From Caesarea, they go to Crete. He was arrested in Jerusalem, taken to Antipatris, then to Caesarea. And it's interesting that there was a Roman centurion named Justus who was given charge of him and the prisoners. This man's going to treat Paul very, very fairly on this trip. The next day they land, and by the way, you're going to see these things pop up here, so if you'll just watch along. The next day they land at Sidon, and this commander allows him to go to shore and meet his friends and be refreshed by them. Then they sail. There's some strong prevailing winds from the northwest, and so if you look how this map is and the line here, they went up north of Cyprus, and the reason they did that was because the winds were blowing from northwest to southeast, and they did that to try to protect themselves and to help the trip be easier. Sailing across the seas of Cilicia and Pamphylia, they landed at Myra and got on a larger ship. And after sailing for a number of days, but they weren't making any progress because of this wind and how terrible it was, they finally arrived at a place called Cnidus. And again, because the prevailing winds are blowing from northwest to southeast, they sailed along the south side of the island of Crete to a town called Fair Havens. And I want you to look where that is over here. They're at this port called Fair Havens, and they remained there for some time, likely through late September, mid-October, a time in the Mediterranean Sea when there can be vicious storms. And realizing that it's a dangerous place, Paul tells them, we need to stay here and winter. But a shipmaster and the owner of the ship convinced the centurion that they could make this trip and everything's going to be well. And they go out here and they start toward Phoenix. If you look over on the end of the island of Crete, they're just going to go a few miles. And oh my, something happens. They start this trip and there's a gentle south wind blowing. The sailors presume that the conditions are favorable for sailing on to Phoenix. By the way, they didn't have the Weather Channel. They didn't have the Weather Channel app on their phone, and so they thought everything's going to be fine. They start sailing toward Phoenix, thinking that these north winds had ceased, and all of a sudden, just after leaving Fair Havens and trying to go around over there to Phoenix, a vicious northeasterly tempest. By the way, the winds have shifted. No longer coming out of the northwest, blowing to the southeast. Now, all of a sudden, they're blowing from northeast to southwest. And a vicious tempest caught this ship and blew it 25 miles southwesterly toward the island called Clauda. By the way, the wind was so fierce and powerful that the soldiers couldn't do a thing with this ship. They just simply had to let it go with the winds. The second day, they began to throw cargo out of that ship, trying to lighten its weight. The third day, they threw all their tackle off the ship. And literally for days, they were in the midst of a storm. In fact, it was so cloudy, they didn't see sun by day or stars by night for days on top of days, and literally had given up hope of survival, chapter 27, verse 20. By the way, the Bible doesn't tell us this. Any of you ever been seasick? Any of you been seasick? That's about as sick as you can get. Can you imagine being out in the middle of a storm like this? And it's so vicious, they can't do a thing with where the ship's going. It's just going as the wind blows it. And how it must have been horrible for these people. In chapter 27, verses 21 to 26, Paul is again assured by the Lord. He sends an angel who tells Paul, your life is going to be spared. You've been promised that you're going to go to the city of Rome, and that's going to happen. And so, they're on this boat. They haven't eaten for days, and Paul gives the other people on this boat some advice. He says to them, we need to stay on this boat. God has told me that we'll be shipwrecked, but nobody will die if we'll just listen and we'll do what he says, because God has told me through an angel that I'm to go to Rome and stand before Caesar, and therefore God has said, I'm not only going to spare you, Paul, but I'm going to spare everybody that's on this ship, all because you're on it. And he urges them to be courageous and confident. He knows that God can be trusted. The wind keeps blowing. And for 14 days, folks, after they left Fair Havens, 2 weeks, they're tossed to and fro in the Adriatic Sea. The ship's sailors have no control. They've given up hope. But all of a sudden, as they're doing some soundings, they realize they're about to hit land, chapter 27, verse 27. And so they put out 4 anchors on the rear of that ship in hopes that the anchors would hold them till daybreak. And some of those sailors, thinking they're going to die, determined that they're going to use a little boat and they're going to get off of this ship and they're going to try to get to safety themselves. Paul warned that centurion and the soldiers, you better stay in the ship because you'll die if you get off of it. And so they cut the rope and let that little old boat float away. As daylight nears, Paul urges, and by the way, the Bible tells us some details just interesting sometimes. As daylight neared, Paul urged the 276 people on this boat, y'all better eat. Because it's been 14 days since we've had anything to eat. You need the strength because we're not going to die. We're going to be spared. And he gave thanks. They all ate. Obviously, that made them feel better. And then they threw all the rest of the grain into the sea, cut the ropes of the anchors, and that boat began to go toward the island of Malta over here on the the very left side of the map. And as it got close there, the ship ran into a sandbar. The front of it was stuck. The back of it is out here being slammed back and forth by the waves. And the back of the ship literally falls off. The soldiers, concerned about the prisoners escaping, were going to kill them. But the centurion, responsible for Paul, said to them, "No, let everybody jump overboard and swim to shore." By the way, they were all safe. Those who couldn't swim grabbed pieces of wood from that ship, and everybody made it to the shore. They come to the shore of the island of Malta, and when they get there, the people are just wonderful to them. They're kind. They help them. Can you imagine these poor people haven't eaten in 2 weeks except just before they get off the boat? They're drowned. They're drenched. They're cold. And so what are you going to do? Well, a lot of us probably have done it. They're going to build a fire. And you know something that happened as they are building a fire, and as Paul placed a bundle of sticks on that fire, do you remember what happened to him? That poisonous snake bit him, and I love this picture because if you look very careful at Paul's hand, you see what the artist is describing there. A snake was hanging on Paul's hand, and immediately all these people on this island who were very superstitious, "Oh, this guy's done something wrong, and he's going to die." Well, what happens? Paul shakes the snake off his hand, and he doesn't get sick, and he doesn't die. And then, realizing that he's not dying, they thought he was a god. Chapter 28, verse 6. Other kind treatment is done here, and they help these people. And then, chapter 28, verses 11 to 15, there's this trip where they sail from Malta on to Italy. By the way, they spent about 3 months on the island of Malta. And then they come, as they get on a boat, headed to Italy. They go to Syracuse, and then to Rhegium, and then to Puteoli, and some brethren met them there. And then they come up to some places on the Italian land, Apiforum, and 3 inns, and ultimately Paul comes to Rome. What happens in the city of Rome? Well, Paul comes there, and in an interview with Jewish leaders, he explains to them some of the things that happened. They haven't even heard about it. And so they're not upset. They're not ready to attack him. They don't really know about the details that happened in the city of Jerusalem. Paul explained his mission, verses 23 to 29, and then, verse 30, he's under house arrest in the city of Rome. But folks, he's able to welcome anybody who wants to come and see him. And so in the city of Rome, Paul taught the gospel unhindered, telling people about the kingdom of God, telling people about Jesus Christ. And when you step outside the book of Acts, there's just a few details that are given in some other books. Romans chapter 1, verse 15 tells us that God used Paul to preach the gospel in Rome. Number 2, in Philippians 1, verses 12 and 13, there were a bunch of people, are y'all ready for this? In Caesar's house who became Christians. There are people in the very palace that Paul had the opportunity to teach because he was in the city of Rome. History suggests that Paul stayed in prison about 2 years. Acts doesn't tell us this, but he stayed in prison about 2 more years before he finally was released from prison here. Now, what do you and I learn from Paul getting to the city of Rome? What can you and I learn from this text tonight? I have 5 things I want to mention. Number 1, no matter what men may do to you, God will be with you. People treated Paul horribly in opposition to him, but God was with him. Number 2, we sing a song sometimes. I wish, Michael, we'd have thought about this and done this one tonight at the end. But ladies and gentlemen, God will take care of you. Amen? God will take care of us. You learn that from Paul's life in this story. Number 3, do you ever say something like this? Well, I just can't find anybody to teach. You know, I'm in places and there's nobody to talk to about Jesus Christ. I learned from Paul in all of these 3 missionary journeys and in this trip to Rome, ladies and gentlemen, there are opportunities to teach Jesus wherever you are. It might be, you go back and study in detail from chapter 21 through chapter 28 of the book of Acts. It may be in the midst of an angry mob. It may be in a trial. It may be in the midst of a storm. It may be in prison. And you see these things over and over in these chapters. But you know what? Everywhere Paul was, there are people that need to hear about this Jesus that I believe in and serve. You never know who may become a child of God if you and I open up our mouths and talk to people about Jesus. Number 4, Jesus is the calm in the midst of the storms of life. Paul was reminded over and over, angels, the Lord telling him, I'm going to take care of you. You're going to go to Rome. You're going to teach the gospel there. You're going to bring people to salvation. And how beautiful it is. The last thing I want to take from this text tonight is simply something that all of us need to help other people understand. And there are places in our life we need to understand it. Brethren, good intentions and even conviction in heart do not bring salvation. Felix and Drusilla were convicted of their sins, but it didn't bring them to change. Agrippa was almost persuaded to become a Christian, yet he never did. That's true of so many today, people who have good intentions. Someday I'm going to obey God, and many who say that never do. Some who say, later in life I'll learn some things about God and His will, and maybe then I'll make the choice to follow Him. Have you all ever heard this statement? The road to hell is paved with good intentions. There will be many people who knew and who wanted to obey later, but never obeyed Christ and never were saved. They had good intentions, but good intentions don't bring salvation by the blood of Christ. I urge us tonight to never allow that to happen to us. Brethren, we can have good intentions. I'm going to talk to somebody as my friend. I'm going to do this good thing for the Lord. I'm going to do this thing to help the congregation. But brethren, good intentions don't get anything done. God help us tonight to be deeply concerned about seeing things that need to be done. If it's about our salvation, if it's about helping others, if it's about teaching the gospel, whatever it may be, not only to have the good intention, but to follow it up and do it while we have the opportunity. Well, tonight, somebody's been thinking about being a Christian for a long time. I'm going to do it. I plan to do it. Why do you wait? Waiting might be your doom. Would you come to Christ while you have breath and life and hope as we stand and sing?